I want to thank Hallwell's, John, and the Hallwell staff for putting this show together. It's always an excellent opportunity to see what artists in Buffalo are doing. So this is my painting called Verdant that I did this year. And I thought I'd talk about it in two different ways. I wanted to talk about the technical issues, the way I painted it, and the medium that I use, which is encaustic. And then I also want to talk about sort of, I guess you'd say, the content. So encaustic is an ancient medium in which the vehicle is beeswax, so painting with it is all based on temperature. And that provides certain limitations, but also certain opportunities. A limitation is that although it's possible, it doesn't lend itself to blending of colors very easily. And so although I do that from time to time, I tend to paint with sort of one color at a time, which may contribute to the somewhat patchwork appearance of the different shapes on the canvas, on the panel rather. So you have to paint on panels. Another aspect of encaustic is that beeswax is an excellent adhesive, and so it lends itself very much to collage. And although this particular painting doesn't have any collage elements, at one point in the process it did. There are several stripes here on the painting that were originally collaged elements. But unlike collage when you use acrylic and you glue something down, it's pretty much there because it's a very powerful adhesive. With encaustic, you can reheat the beeswax and collage elements can be removed. And that's what happened in some of these larger stripe areas, although in some cases I've sort of repainted parts of them as well. So that's one aspect that lends itself, that I find attractive about encaustic, is that flexibility in using collage that you don't get with other mediums. Another challenge with encaustic is that it's very difficult to paint thin lines because the amount of paint that you put on a small brush is so small that it cools too quickly. It's possible using this edge of a fan blender, you can get lines. But I also use a tool called a janting needle, which is a little funnel that artists who use batik use as a wax resist for dyeing fabric. And so they heat the so-called needle, and they put clear wax in it and put it on fabric. But what I often do is just put encaustic paint in the electrically heated janting needle, and that's how I was able to get these very crisp lines. Those white lines are created by this tool, because often with encaustic, sometimes I paint on an easel, but often I paint with the panel horizontal, and that's the easier way to use the janting needle. I've been working, I'm also known for working with trees as a kind of form of landscape. But back in a couple of years ago, I began making a lot of small collages, and I did a lot of work in which I took encaustic monotype prints and cut them out and layered them onto other works on paper for an exhibition I had at Western New York Book Arts. And so I was already kind of moving away from more recognizable imagery. And then last year, almost in a way as a kind of escape from the social and political divisions we've been experiencing in our country, I moved to a completely non-objective realm. And I am sort of reminded of Henri Matisse, who 120 years ago said that he liked to paint because it was sort of an escape from all the chaos and things in the world. Another inspiration, interestingly, was some paintings that I saw on Instagram by an artist in Toronto an encaustic painter named Anastasia Bettis. And I kind of like them, but the key for me was the use of lines. And it sort of triggered a direction. Because there are so many ways to make lines in interesting ways with encaustic, seeing these paintings just started a new series, essentially, of work in which I made lines with the enchanting needle. I also made lines by melting lines with a wood burning tool, which has different types of tips that you can put on a wood burning tool, so you can make wider lines or thinner lines. And also because as an artist, last year I was 70 years old and have a pretty large inventory of work, it became in my mind kind of problematic to create more big panels because they require storage. And so instead, I began looking at earlier works that were never completed. And so I reused them. I used them as supports for a series of works that were more or less monochrome, deep blues or red violet or yellow ochre, that then were interspersed with these various kinds of lines and also various textures. The textures can be rough, and you can get broken color by layering and scraping, but you can also get areas that are very, very smooth by laying the painting flat and burning it in excessively. What is that? That means reheating the surface. I typically use a heat gun, but you can also use a heat lamp or even a creme brulee torch. If you excessively burn it in, the wax gets very smooth, like enamel. So I can contrast rough or broken textures with very smooth, glossy textures. So I was doing that with these, and also because they were, with the exception of certain other color incidents, maybe contrasting colors, they were pretty much monochrome paintings. And with the emphasis on lines, it also reminded me of an earlier series of work that I did called tree glyphs, in which there's sort of a linear tree image on a monochrome field. And so this was, in a way, in my mind, was sort of revisiting that approach a little bit. Another aspect of this work and these other works that I started a little over a year ago is the sense of kind of an aerial view. Almost looks like you're looking down on gridded land or gridded fields. And this also connected for me with some famous artists in the past who've also found that as a stimulus, notably Paul Klee, whose work I researched as working on my master's degree in art history, and also Richard Diebenkorn, who was very stimulated by a plane trip that he took from San Francisco to Albuquerque back in the early 50s. So there's that aspect too. One aspect of this painting that's a little bit different than those earlier ones that I was referring to is that there is a little more suggestion of space, as if some of these elements are closer, and then you can kind of look beyond the picture plane into the behind the picture plane a little bit. It's not that. Let's see, it's not that distinctive, but there's a sense of that I also kind of enjoy about this painting. I think that's about all that I wanted to say about it. Question?
Yeah. The lines that you make.
Yes.
Do you use a ruler or something to keep them straight?
Yes.
Okay.
I have some little piece of, piece of wood, typically that I sometimes use. I have rulers also, but I often use some pieces of wood to align certain lines for sure. There's also, I mentioned scraping, and I have these flexible stainless steel tools called surface knives that I can use to scrape, but you can also use it to create an edge. So if I want to create a neat edge, I can just hold that up and paint right over it, and it'll create a crisp edge. So I use that tool a lot also, yes.
Now, is that wood? I didn't hear.
It's actually gator board.
What is
Or
it?
gator foam. Gator board is a very rigid but light support. It's similar to foam core. Are you familiar with foam core?
Yeah.
Foam core has a processed paper with a styrofoam core or styrene core. Gator board is similar, except that instead of a processed paper, it's processed wood fiber.
Okay.
So it's a little heavier and a little stronger. It's archival. It's a really terrific support because this one's small, but I can do a large one and still be able to move it around easily. Whereas I also use birch plywood as a support, but when those are big, they get pretty heavy. Thank you for the questions.